some people aspire to being in a state of empathy with the child at the time that they're correcting the child's behavior. And that's a really valuable point of view to take for a couple of reasons. The most important one is, if you're really empathic with your child at the time that you're correcting their behavior, you're going to want to know why. Why did they act that way? Just the way you wonder that about yourself when you've done something that you regret later, and children do regret their misbehaviors later, but to take a look at the meaning of the behavior for the child. So I think the most important part of empathy is really understanding the meaning. Certainly putting yourself in the child's position to say, how would I feel if someone said that to me, is sort of the basis of morality, isn't it? And that is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or the opposite of it, which is don't do unto others what you wouldn't want them to do unto you. And while children learn empathy, you might say, how? How do they learn empathy? Well, in fact, they have empathy by about age 3. But part of the way they get it is through their interaction with adults who are being empathic with them, who are striving to understand what their cues mean and to respond appropriately to those cues. So empathy is probably the thing that saves us as human beings, when it does save us, and it maybe doesn't as much as we'd like it to, and also that distinguishes us from animals who act more out of reflexes and less out of an understanding of what the other person in the relationship, in that case another animal in the relationship, might be thinking in that circumstance. So I think empathy is what makes us human, and it's something that should be part of any system of discipline in order to be truly humane and human.
It's almost standard these days, almost politically correct, to argue that people who have been traumatized or abused, punished in childhood, need to stop whining, stop blaming their parents, take responsibility for their own behavior. Because after all, once you're an adult, if you're successful or not, if you're having emotional problems or not, it's your responsibility to do something about that. And there's a point to be made there. I think there's a valid point. Certainly, having been physically punished in childhood is not an excuse for adult behavior, for going on to hit your own children or your spouse. But childhood physical punishment is certainly a reason for difficulties in adulthood. We've seen that childhood physical punishment is associated with higher rates of depression, suicidal ideas, alcoholism, and so on. So there's a connection between the experiences of childhood and adult difficulties, emotional difficulties, and behavioral problems. I think that the argument that to point to childhood physical punishment as a reason for adult difficulties, people who call that whining or making excuses, what they're really doing is denying the importance of childhood physical punishment. On the one hand, they say, yes, you were punished or you were abused or you were traumatized as a child, and that's bad. But then they deny the very seriousness of that by saying, well, you're an adult now, so somehow it doesn't matter, get over it. And it's not so simple to get over it. And this is really not, to me anyway, a moral issue. It's just a practical issue. Until people feel the emotions, the fear and the rage and the sadness associated with their experiences in childhood, they're not going to be able to have empathy for themselves or for anybody else, and they're going to have a lot of difficulty changing behaviors like spouse abuse, child abuse. It's difficult for someone who is denied his or her own childhood grief and fear and anger to have empathy with children, with their natural feelings. And it's difficult, we think, for adults who've denied their own childhood pain to have empathy with anyone who's suffering, whether it's the victims of some sort of political oppression, victims of a war. And I think that's dangerous, very dangerous, when, as a consequence of having no empathy for ourselves, we're not able to have empathy for others. We're not able to recognize anybody else's suffering. It's too apt to remind us of our own suffering, and that's too difficult to deal with. What happens to an individual who's physically punished in childhood? The child can't afford to feel the pain, the grief and sorrow and helplessness that's just too threatening. It's too difficult to live with. And so, as we've said, children learn to deny their own feelings. And adults encourage that. They encourage children to deny the pain associated with punishment. That process of denying one's own pain, though, we think may have consequences on a much larger scale. If you have a culture that supports the use of physical punishment in childhood, and specifically the denial of the emotions resulting from physical punishment, you have a collection of large numbers of individuals who are incapable of having empathy for themselves and also are incapable of having empathy for others, for the suffering of other human beings. We think that a dynamic may operate that contributes to genocide. A child who grows up and denies the vulnerability, the helplessness that he or she felt years ago, as I said before, can't afford to see that vulnerability or helplessness in a child who's crying. And often adults with a history of physical punishment will react with rage or annoyance to the sound of a child crying.
So discipline is a way of trying to get children to do things. The problem in our society is that we're wedded to the concept of physically forcing kids to do things and trying to get them to do things because of fear of pain. Now let me explain what I mean by that. There's two ways to raise children, basically. One is I call moral persuasion. That is, from the earliest age, you try to convince the child, don't hit your brother because it hurts your brother and you know what it's like to be hurt. Now that's a tough message to give a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old kid, but you have to start from an early age. And what you do is you try to rationally persuade the child to not hurt somebody else because you know how it is to be hurt. And that's called empathy. And that's called teaching children high levels of morality based on doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do.